Hi everyone, thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today I'm at César Chávez National Monument in Keene, California, and I sat down with Park Superintendent Erin Gates. We talked all about the life and legacy of César Chávez. This has been a really special day being at César Chávez National Monument. I've learned so much over the last couple of weeks in preparation to coming here, but actually being here and getting to meet with you and your small but mighty team has been really special.
It's been really nice having you. And I love, like we were talking about before, you got the bug, right?
I got the bug.
And every time, like that's all we want, right? Is people get a little glimpse of this story and they realize how special and powerful it is and they get the bug. You got the bug.
In this podcast, we're gonna talk about the life and legacy of César Chávez. We did another episode earlier today that'll come out after this one, but about how the National Park Service preserves more than just beautiful natural landscapes, but really special stories that have shaped America. And I don't know if you can name a whole lot of other people more important when it comes to labor and civil rights in America than César Chávez.
No, except for his heroes, right? The people that he used as inspiration, including Martin Luther King, being that American story, but Mahatma Gandhi and the work that he was doing in India.
So let's start from the very beginning with César Chávez. As a young boy growing up in Yuma, Arizona, what was that environment like for him?
I think his original early years were probably lovely, like getting to grow up on land that his family owned. His grandparents were the ones that had originally settled in Arizona and were quite prosperous. They actually helped develop Arizona because of, their contributions to early Arizona, if you will. But then everything turned, right? And we all have those like pivotal moments, right? That arc in the journey, in the hero story, where his family lost their property during the Great Depression and they had to pack everything up and get in their car and become migrant farm workers. And that's how he got his first experience with the farm worker life, was after his family lost everything during the Depression.
And I assume since that was his first experience in the migrant farm working life, that's probably the first time he really experienced the discrimination that Mexican Americans had faced, especially on the farms during that time period.
I would imagine as it relates to the farms, right? But we're also talking about 1920s, 1930s America. So I'm sure he experienced some of that discrimination just as, being a Mexican-American child, like growing up in that era.
What was next after that for César Chávez? I know he stopped schooling after 8th grade. Mm-hmm. What was that process like after moving to California?
Just what ends up being the story for so many, right? That once your parents aren't able to be the ones to put the food on the table, everyone becomes part of putting the food on the table. And so he and his brothers and sisters end up being migrant farm workers, alongside their parents and working hard in the farms and getting to experience, migrant farm worker life in the 1930s and the 1940s was rough, right? There were migrant farm worker camps where the living conditions were incredibly poor, right? We have that example of a migrant farm worker house that's in the visitor center, and it actually has metal walls and a roof, and it might be tin metal and it may heat up in the summer and freeze in the winter, but you were almost lucky if you had tin roofs and tin walls instead of just a tent. Oftentimes it was just a tent, and your one little space that may be 6 feet by 8 feet is your bedroom and your living room and your dining room. Your restrooms are outside. There isn't any kind of private shower or anything that we would almost assume as being just a general luxury today, or maybe even a basic necessity. Were not something you would find in a migrant farm worker camp. And so that's what he got to experience. So he almost went from the American dream to losing the American dream, and yet being the one that was putting the food on the tables for everyone else that got to experience that dream.
I think this part of César's life is very pivotal in who he ended up becoming and what he ended up doing. As he grew older, he joined the Navy for a couple of years, and that's when he met his wife.
Yep.
And after he met his wife, they started their family. A little bit later down the line, he meets Fred Ross. And what did Fred Ross mean to César Chávez?
I think Fred Ross showed César what community organizing looks like, and also probably like awakened a spirit inside of César of recollecting what he had seen when he was a kid, and that there are people out there struggling and nobody's fighting for them, or they are and they lose because what they're fighting against is so powerful politically and otherwise. And so I think this almost happens for many of us, right? Where we go to school, we graduate, whether it's from high school or from college, and then we set ourselves up for this path, right, that was laid out in front of us that we are supposed to follow, right? Mm-hmm. That we get the good job, we get the nice home, we get the house, we get the family, and we're supposed to be happy, and we're supposed to be fulfilled. And at least for me, and I guess I'm thinking even for you, with you developing this podcast, there's that moment when you're like, just this standard job is not fulfilling me. And I think that's probably what happened to him too, is that he's learning about these community organizing techniques from Fred Ross. He's getting reconnected to the struggles that Latinos and Mexican Americans are facing in this country, but then he's remembering all of the struggles that he experienced himself, that he knows are still happening in the farms, and there's nobody out there speaking for the farm workers.
And with Fred Ross developed the CSO, the Community Service Organization, and they were creating a voice for Latinos and Mexican Americans, but ultimately César became a director and moved to LA, had this great job like you just mentioned, but he knew that the real way to connect with Latinos and Mexican Americans was on the farms. Yep. In Central California. And so that's when he worked with his wife to move to Central California and give up that life. Yeah. What was that process like between him and Helen to come to an agreement to give up this life with their 8 kids to move to an area with a whole lot of uncertainty?
I am sure there were some, like that saying, if you could be a fly on the wall, right? To be a fly on the wall of the kitchen, listening to the conversations that they were having at that time. And I think that this is that moment, one of the many moments where Helen Chávez comes in as being this unsung hero of the movement, is because he couldn't have done that if she wasn't willing to do that. And it wasn't just even her willingness to do that. When they made that choice to leave their middle-class American lifestyle behind, and he started really diving into the farm worker movement and the organizing, someone still had to make money. And so she's going back to the farms, right? She's the one that's laboring for the family so that César could go off and start really doing the work that he was doing. And so kind of, if you look at the span of this whole process, who was the backbone, right? Who was the one that was supporting him all along the way? It was her. And so when I have the pleasure of listening to the family talk about this story, that is something that is spoken about regardless of who I'm talking to, is just how Helen played such an essential role in this movement. But she never wanted the credit. She never needed the limelight. And her role that she played was to be the foundation that César could lean on, so he could then go off and do these extraordinary things.
That's why, when I think of this story, it's such an American dream type story, and so obviously important for Mexican Americans and just humans in general, because he had built up this American dream. He made it, and ultimately he decided that wasn't what he was put on earth for, right? It was to serve people and create a better environment than what he had experienced from when he was a kid. You had mentioned that Helen went back out onto the fields to work so that César could do his work. What was the early work when he moved to this area that he was doing?
I think originally, he and the predominant Mexican American farm workers, they were organizing. And so they are organizing while at the same time you have the Filipino farm workers that are organizing. And this is what leads us to that pivotal moment, the Delano grape strike, where you have these two different organizations that are both trying to fight for the right of farm workers. And yet what large industrial farms would often do is they would pit the races against each other, where, let's say, the Mexican American farm workers would go on strike, so then they would have the Filipino farm workers come in to break that strike, right? And why that Delano grape strike was such an incredibly pivotal moment is that it was the Filipino farm workers and their union that they decided to go on strike and say enough is enough. And when César and the union he's representing is deciding whether or not they're going to join the Filipino farm workers on their strike, it was actually Helen again who apparently comes into the room and basically says, are we a union or not? And that statement right there was just that idea of like solidarity. Like, are we fighting for the right of farm workers or not? Because if we're fighting for the right of farm workers, that includes Mexican-American farm workers and Filipino farm workers. It includes farm workers from other Latin American countries. It includes all different cultural and racial backgrounds of farm workers. And that really was that moment where that decision stripped away one of the greatest powers that had been used up to that point, which is divide the races, and that will disempower them.
César was obviously wildly successful in creating this union and fighting for proper circumstances for farm workers, but he wasn't the first to try this.
Right.
And the people that came before him to try it were educated, were wealthy, and were unsuccessful. So how did César do it?
Because that's one of my favorite sayings is imitation is the highest form of flattery, right? And because he was so well studied, and again, right, self-taught, he stopped going to school after 8th grade. So because he had studied all of these other movements, right, whether it's the movement of Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, but also looking at other unionizing and organizing movements, he borrowed, right, different successful techniques of all of those different movements and brought them together, right? So, for example, with the Delano grape strike, now, just because they went on strike didn't mean that all of a sudden, the farm owners are coming to the table. It took the national boycott that actually brought the farm workers to the table. And we think of boycotts and, we think of the Martin Luther King, the work that Martin Luther King did and, the boycotts that happened as part of that movement, that civil rights movement. And so he borrowed that, but then he also recognized that if you're going to want to encourage people to be a member of a union, you're going to have to provide them other services that they need. And so they're offering services, they're offering pension plans, they're offering medical plans, they're offering basic needs that these farm workers had that they were not going to ever get met by the industry that was employing them, but they could get them met by the union that was representing them.
You mentioned that imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, and some of the examples of César pulling from some of his idols. One of those things is fasting. He fasted 3 times. Can you talk about those 3 separate occasions and why he fasted and what he was, protesting for in that way?
Yeah, and I'll focus on, for the sake of time, I'll focus on the first and the last fast. The first fast was it was almost his way, and we actually had this conversation earlier when I was walking you around the visitor center. So the first fast was after he started to see an uptick in the violence of the movement, and the violence that was being directed at the farm workers while they were on strike. As we had talked about, there are 5 people that gave the ultimate sacrifice for this movement, and we refer to them as the 5 martyrs. So as he's seeing an uptick in the level of violence that's being perpetuated onto the farm workers, he's also seeing the level of anger that is growing inside the farm workers wanting to strike back. And, perhaps thinking their only method of striking back was through violence. And so that first fast of, I believe it was 25 days, was him almost feeling guilty about the initial death of the 2 martyrs, the first 2 martyrs of the movement, the first 3 martyrs. But what it did is it drew the attention of all the other farm workers to see, okay, he's paying penance. He's honoring that their lives shouldn't have had to be lost, and he's just stopping eating. But what it also did is it served to get some significant attention, and not just attention from the media and obviously other external sources, but more importantly, attention from the farm workers themselves. And he ended up stopping that fast after the farm workers all collectively signed an agreement that promised that they would maintain this as a nonviolent movement.
And the last one you said you were going to mention on the fast.
Thank you. Yeah, that one for me is the one that, I don't know, all of the fasts were very powerful, but I just think of that one, that was in the 80s, and it was his longest fast, 36 days, just drinking water. And that fast was to draw attention to the use of pesticides and herbicides on farm workers. And the fact that they weren't just going out and picking crops that had pesticides and herbicides on them, but they were in the fields while these pesticides and herbicides were being sprayed. And specifically drawing attention to the high rates of cancer that farm workers would develop, but then the severe disabilities that their children would be born with. And as I had referred to you, one of my colleagues, Cam Juarez, has a personal connection to that story. And I think maybe that's why that fast for me is so meaningful, in that, César himself wasn't necessarily suffering, but he was drawing attention to not only the suffering of the farm workers, but also to the suffering of our planet, right? With the use of pesticides and herbicides. He was so ahead of his time in so many ways. And that concept of environmental justice was something that, that he was practicing way before it became a coined term. And so through that long fast, that's the fast that, really helped to draw attention to something that none of us knew at the time. And to be honest, none of us really know much about still today. Like, it's another piece of this story. I never learned about that when I was a kid. And yet to meet somebody, my colleague, who was directly affected by that and born with disabilities because his mom was working in the farms and was sprayed, like, that makes you have a really personal connection to something. So many people believe, his parents lived until their 90s and early hundreds, and he died at a young age, right? He died in 1993, he was in his 60s. And some people believe that it was all the strain to his body from those 3 fasts, that may have led to his early death. So in a way, his fasts were his ultimate sacrifice to trying to draw attention to something so important.
And what role did César's Catholic faith play in his life?
Both the Catholic faith, but also just spirituality in general. He grew up in a very spiritual home. His mom, Juana, was known as a healer. And she actually used to tell the kids, we will feed people that don't have food available to them. So what we are now referring to as houseless, right? But people without homes. César was told as a kid to go out and find these people. And they back then referred to them with the name hobos, but were told to go out and find these hobos and bring them back to the house and feed them. So that was something that was like always kind of already ingrained in him. And I think it was his mom that really started that. But he went to a Catholic school when he was a kid, and he was introduced to, and I'm looking at some notes while I tell you this because I want to make sure to get this right, Father Donald McDonald. And Father Donald McDonald was a huge influence on him. He was actually the one that really started to talk to César, about like Catholic social justice teachings. And he's the one that introduced César to Fred Ross. So just even that, making that connection, right? So I think that faith is a really personal thing, right? So I can tell you these details as we know them, based on like archival records, but, even in his office, you saw many references to Catholicism in his office. I think that idea of sacrifice, which is so prevalent in everything he did, right? From his choice to leave his nice, middle-class lifestyle to his choices to fast, draw attention to things. He never took vacations, right? That was after he made this choice to dedicate his life to this movement, right? He made a lot of sacrifices. I think that was probably in line with teachings that he had. But I haven't read that much that is him talking about his own faith. I think he just practiced it, right? And for me, I think that exemplifies how much faith and importance in his spirituality that he had, right? Is that he practiced, he didn't preach. I also love how interested he was in other faiths, right? So several of the books that are on the bookshelves in his office aren't about Catholicism, they're about other religions. Even the martyrs, right? Two of the people that lost their lives as part of this movement, they weren't Catholic. One of them was a young Jewish girl and the other was a young Muslim man, right? And so this movement was a representation of people, regardless of the color of their skin or the religion in their heart, coming together and wanting to dedicate their lives to making the lives of other people better, regardless of what religion, they had.
You mentioned practicing his faith. Right behind us, if you're listening, there's a hill behind us. Mm-hmm. And what did César use that hill for every morning?
He would, thank you, by the way, for mentioning that, because I love this part of the story, is he woke up every morning, and this is anecdotal from his son, Anthony, who was 12 years old when they moved into the home here on the property. But he'd wake up every morning around 4:30 and leave the house, climb to the top of this hill, which is not an easy climb for your listeners. It would not be an easy climb for any of us, let alone at 4:30 in the morning, and he probably didn't have a cup of coffee beforehand. But he would climb to the top of the hill every morning, and he would sit and he would meditate and he'd watch the sunrise. And he also practiced yoga too. We actually have photos of him like sitting in a yoga pose. And I love that part of this story too, because that example that we have to take care of ourselves, right? Even the old saying that we hear every time we're on a flight, don't worry about somebody else's mask until you put your mask on first. And so even though he made all of these personal sacrifices with his time and with his money and even with his health, he also took the time he needed to get grounded. And every once in a while, when this place is really quiet, and especially I think first thing in the morning, I might be out here in the garden mowing his grave, or helping water the flowers around his gravesite. And I just have these little personal connection moments with him and with Helen, and they help me remember how important it is that I make sure that I charge my battery too, right? Because when we are trying to live a life of service, when we're trying to do good work for the world, it's taxing and it takes a lot of energy out of us. And we're not going to be able to continue with our work if we don't remember to continue to put ourselves back on the charger.
I know another thing that you love is if you look back into his office, you see his jazz collection of cassettes. And I love that too, because we just talked about this, recharging your batteries. I think we all think César was extraordinary. Mm-hmm. But if he were talking to us, he would tell us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, right? And I think all these details of him meditating on the hill behind us and having, jazz cassette tapes scattered around his desk, shows us that he was a human being first.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, he was funny, right? And I mean, even just the jazz, like what I love about that is you think like, all right, greatest Latino civil rights leader of the 20th century, right? He must be this symbol of all things like Chicano culture. And yeah, sure, he liked that music too. But in his office, with his own handwriting on these mixed tapes that he made, right, are Count Basie and Louis Armstrong and, all of these good old classic, like big time jazz. And so that breaks a mold, right? Like we cannot be defined. We cannot be pigeonholed or put, make a box around us that's nice and clean and neat. We are all complicated beings, right? And our complications, some of them are great, some of them, are less than great. But like the combination of what makes us who we are, this mosaic of color, is what ultimately defines us. And so one of the things I really love about this property and this monument and this visitor center is it takes this larger than life figure that people may or may not actually know anything about, more than just he's named after he has a holiday named after him, and he's street names are named after him and neighborhoods are named after him. But it takes this larger than life figure and his contributions, and it brings it down to a level where everyone can see the humanness and of him. But in seeing the humanness of him and his wife Helen and their lifestyle, I think ultimately what I hope everyone walks away from here is that they can see themselves in him, and that they can see that if César can do it, and if Larry Itlong can do it, and Dolores Huerta, and all of these other key figures that helped make this movement happen, if they can do it, then what can we do, right? If they are ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, or they were, then, and I'm an ordinary person, and then what am I capable of achieving? Like, it gives me hope that I too could be doing something big. And maybe it's even giving me a sense of responsibility, right? Recognizing that, you know, maybe that's part of my quest on this planet. And if there's part of me that's, you know, that's feeling like that sense of that tiny itching feeling or that vacancy, right? Maybe it's because I haven't fulfilled it quite yet, right? My ability to serve others. And this is such an example for all of us to get to study one of the greats and then find ourselves in his story.
Yeah, I think one of the things, as you just mentioned, that I love is we're told that we are supposed to live a certain lifestyle. You find a good job that treats you well so you can live this lifestyle and have a family and own a house. He was kind of not the anti that, but he achieved that and moved on because he knew that his purpose here was greater than that. And I think a lot of us, you know, for some people that lifestyle is for them, but other people there's a yearning in you for trying something and for helping people and for serving and creating something that's bigger than you and that will outlive you and create a legacy like we talk about. One of the things that I also think is so special about this national monument is César and his life and his family is so special that a lot of his family is still here.
Yes, and oh my goodness, I mean, I've been working in parks, whether they are state or national parks, for 15 plus years of my life, and most of the parks I've worked at were very natural resource focused. So to get to work at a very significant historical and cultural resource focused park and to have the story still intimately woven into the space is such an incredible treat. Like, so many of the things that I've just talked to you about, I did not read them in books. I listened to them, right, from the mouths of his sons or his grandson or his granddaughter, and having them be such an active part, not only of continuing his legacy in their work, but having them be such an active part and partner in this space is incredible, right? Because it's a tangible example of continuing to see this story and seeing it intimately. Like I shared with you, we did a virtual tour of this place for Department of Interior employees for Hispanic Heritage Month. And when I was kind of designing that tour, I was just like, I'm not going to speak. Like, this is not my story. This is their story. And if they are going to be willing and able to share their story in the way that they've shared it with me to all these other people out there, that's going to allow those people to have that same intimate connection to the story that I've had the pleasure of having. And that's what happened, and it was really beautiful. So yeah, we have regular interactions with the family. Actually, one of César's grandsons, Andres Chávez, he's the executive director of our park partner, who's the National Chávez Center. The National Chávez Center is responsible for the property that surrounds the National Monument. So the National Monument is a little 3-acre island, if you will, that sits inside of a 120-acre National Historic Landmark. And the remaining portion of the National Historic Landmark is owned and operated by the National Chávez Center.
That's amazing. It's this place really is special, and you mentioned the gravesite. One thing that I also find fascinating, amongst many other things, with César, is his dogs are also buried with him. His two best friends, as he says, and the story on why he got the dogs and why he became vegan and vegetarian because of them is really fascinating too.
Right, and yeah. Well, first of all, this is a pop quiz. Do you remember the dogs' names?
Yeah, Boycott and Strike.
Good job, good job. But not Strike in English, it's Strike in Spanish, which is Huelga.
Okay.
Yep. But good job.
I'll give myself half credit on that.
I'm so impressed, dude. I'm so impressed. Yeah, he got the dogs when he found out that, so they moved, the family and the movement moved from Delano, which is in the heart of the Central Valley, up to this property in the early 1970s. And they did it for a lot of different reasons. One is Delano was like in the middle of the battlefield. There's 40 acres is the name of the property where the UFW was once headquartered. There's a little gas station that's in 40 acres, and there's a part of the building where you can see where a bomb had gone off because people were directly trying to attack that site. And it's right off Highway 99. It's very centralized. But what they realized when they moved here is, one, it gave them an opportunity to have just a safe retreat, right? A place where that they could organize. There was 300 to 400 people living here. It's where they could be just super strategic in the development of what's next, right? In terms of the movement. But it also was strategic in that you've got the Central Valley, the Salinas Valley, all of these very, very predominant growing areas that are along Interstate 99 or Interstate 5, Highway 99 or Interstate 5 in the Central Valley of California. But you also have a growing area near Mexico in the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valleys. So by having this property be located in this little random spot in the middle of nowhere in the southern Sierra Nevada foothills, you were actually centralizing the headquarters of the UFW between the major growing areas. So, long-winded, I'm getting to your answer, I promise. So in the early 70s, he's coming up here, he's moving up here, and he hears from the FBI that there's somebody that is out to assassinate him. And initially, he goes into hiding. But it's not long, like maybe a few weeks, where he realizes, no, like, I'm not going to let them scare me away. I'm not running. And so he moves back to the property. He surrounds his home with a chain link fence that's still there. And he gets these guard dogs, and he gets German Shepherd dogs that were actually, just like police dogs, sent to Germany for training. And his favorites were Boycott and Huelga. And when he buried them in a little patch of land right outside of his office, and when he died, he had told his wife he wants to be buried next to Boycott and Huelga. But this is a crazy story I just heard, is you can't just bury yourself on property. And I don't know exactly the full details behind this, but he ended up, he had passed, but his family ended up having to get permission from the Catholic Church to designate this tiny little parcel of land as a two-person cemetery in order to work their way around rules that were in place that would not have allowed him to be buried here. And, being a Catholic, there was a very short window of time from when he passed to when he needed to be buried, that traditionally, and so they were somehow managed to navigate all that right after his death, and within 3 days he was able to be buried in this spot.
That is a special story.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what did he achieve? What do we see today that is in direct relation to César Chávez and what he put together?
Oh, I don't even know if there's any way like that I possibly could answer that question. And part of the reason I'm saying that is I could answer that question in terms of the details of what he achieved for farm workers' rights. One of the many things he achieved is better wages, right? Better working conditions, better living conditions, being treated like a human being, But he built these organizations that have continued that work, right? César Chávez Foundation is building really nice low-income housing, right, all across the country. You have the United Farm Workers are still doing great work. These are all like ripples from the original work that he and so many other people did collectively together. But also just the influence, and the reason I said I can't speak to this is, for anyone that's not watching the YouTube video, I'm a Caucasian woman in my mid-40s, and yes, I grew up in Southern California, and I grew up around a lot of Chicano culture. I'm not Chicano, and so it's not my story to tell. But what I can say is that this movement and this empowerment, right, and this solidarity influenced so many different elements of our culture into the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. It influenced music, it influenced art, right? It influenced our society. So I really don't think that there's a way of defining all of the ways it influenced. It's like a very large stone got dropped into a pond, and it's hard to measure where all the ripples ended up going and then what those ripples led to, new ripples. So I think the influence continues to happen.
In reading about César Chávez, one thing that I read with Chicano culture that I really love is the phrase of that who carries the sack knows what's inside of it. And that directly relates to César obviously being a migrant farm worker, knowing and relating to the people that he fought for. But he fought for a lot of people outside of the farm workers as well. Mm-hmm. He was on the front lines of protesting in San Francisco for LGBTQ rights in the 70s. Mm-hmm. He was a civil rights leader, not just a labor and farm worker leader, which is really amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, that environmental justice, right? He was on the forefront of talking about, significant environmental concerns. Oh, and that was going back to your comment. Yeah, he was a vegetarian and a vegan, and he practiced a macrobiotic diet because he was studying how kind of the nature of like the diet, right? And how, why do people of color have a higher rate of diabetes, right? And the kind of decolonizing the diet, right? And recognizing that everybody, regardless of their color or their wealth or their status in this society, regardless of how far they've traveled on the American dream journey, they deserve to have healthy food on their tables. They deserve to not be covered in pesticides when they come home to try to hug their kids at night, right? They deserve to have clean working conditions and restrooms and shade structures and water, basic necessities provided to them when they're out working, right? So he just believed in making the world a better place for everybody. There's a quote, remind me when we're wrapping, there's a quote of his that's from his Commonwealth speech that I would love to kind of share as like a wrap up that is so powerful for me. I include it in my email signature because it just kind of speaks to exactly what you said. This was so much more than a movement to look after the rights of farm workers, right? This was a movement, this was an empowerment movement.
And as we do tie a bow on this, I think one thing that's amazing is after he had passed away, President Bill Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor that a civilian can receive in this country. And obviously an ultimate testament to his work for America and really for the world.
Absolutely. And, and sometimes that's it, right? Sometimes your influence isn't noticed when you're in the middle of doing the work you're doing. And one of the things, again, that his family has shared with me is he was defeated way more times than he succeeded. But it's how he reacted to the defeat. And I think that's another great life lesson that this place and the story and his life teaches us, is just because you don't win every time doesn't mean you don't keep showing up. And I think also that lesson about humility, right? If you are constantly looking for acknowledgments and accolades and credit, that's going to take away the power of your influence. But if you just keep showing up every day and your heart is in the right place, that's what's going to influence people and influence change for the good.
Well, as we wrap up, do you want to? Yes, please.
Okay. So for any of your listeners that want to learn more, and I hope you do, this is again from the Commonwealth speech, and so even if you just Googled that, you would be able to find it. It said, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore.
That's powerful.
Thank you so much for giving this little park with a really big story a chance to get a bit more exposure. And hopefully this will inspire some of your viewers or listeners to come see us. And I invite everybody to come for a visit. We would love to have you.
I told you when I spent some time here today that this is easily the most impactful thing that we've had the chance to do so far with this platform, and being able to share this story. And it's so relatable today, and it'll be relatable tomorrow.
Yep.
And I think it only enhances, what travelers, explorers, and just human beings will experience in the world just by knowing this story. So thank you for sharing it, and thank you for being a part of this.
Absolutely, and we'll see you for one of our special events coming up soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. Cesar Chávez's life and legacy is a story that should be shared and told forever. So if you like this type of content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as it really does help out our channel. And until next time, safe travels.